the reasons for climate change, and what we can expect from in terms of issues of climate change. So we see so much information about climate change, going on. For 50 years, 197 countries signed a framework convention. In the United States, they're talking about a Green New Deal. But at the same time, in the news, we see terrible disasters taking place. We see the fires in California. We see the floods in North Carolina, the floods in Texas. We see the floods in India, in southern part of Africa. So many things are happening. So much information is out there about climate change. Yet, all the changes that are going on. I mean, there's a lot of positive things that are taking place. There's a lot of positive developments. We have the capability to really deal with a lot of the issues in climate change and make improvements, but they're not happening. And that's the real issue of today, I think, is that we're not seeing that the change is really happening like it should be happening. So we really intend to have kind of a subtext when we talk about things like climate change or coronavirus and a lot of the other issues that we have in the world today. And for me, the climate change subtext is that, if we look at this planet as the example we see on the screen, and we see the thin layer of stratosphere is where the carbon dioxide is being accumulating, causing the planet to warm up, it becomes obvious that we really live in an interconnected world. And in fact, the Earth is really like one country. And in order to solve a lot of these issues that we're faced with today, really major issues, we're probably going to need some kind of new kind of global governance so that we really take these issues correctly and we begin to work on them. Because I think if we don't work on them, and that's the big issue, I think, if we don't work on them, like in the case of the coronavirus, we will see these things growing and creating huge problems for us. And we have methods that we can fall to and we can think about and we can coordinate to solve some of these things, but not if we keep going in the same way as we've been going for the last years. And so, just let me talk a little bit about, the climate activism. Yes, when I was a young person, I was very much involved in climate activism. And in the Bahá'í world today, of course, the strategies for change for the future are really being implemented by the Bahá'í community in a wonderful way, building the foundation for the future. But I think, we also have to recognize that the role of youth in making these changes happen is going to be something that really needs to be considered. If anybody's interested, I can talk about why in Ukraine, for example, we went through a revolution recently, and what was the role of youth in this revolution, and if the youth had not arisen to make the changes that took place in the last 5 years, what kind of country would live in Ukraine today? Completely different from what we're actually seeing. It's now an independent country. It would be very much a part of the Russian Federation had we not seen youth coming to the scene in about 5 years ago. So the youth movements, I think, what a point I really want to make is the youth movements are really vital to change. And maybe it's not right of me to say this, but I have no confidence whatsoever, really, that the political systems in the world today are going to address these issues fast enough without some kind of involvement of activists and youth activists and adults that work with the youth, and we come together to deal with these issues as a society, and maybe a groundswell from the bottom up begins to impact on the political processes that are still operating in the same way as they've been operating for the last 30 or 40 or 50 years, which has led to the problems that we have in the world today. So, on the slide here, you can see examples of just wonderful youth activists. On the bottom, you see Greta Thunberg, Malala, and the Parkland students, issues from climate change to women's education, to gun violence, and all of these things are really being taken up by the young people of today. And I think it's really important that we recognize that and we support it. Of course, in the Baha'i community also, we have huge programs and development and very much priorities, I think, for the Baha'i world. But my personal opinion is that I don't think the Baha'i faith and all of the activities of Baha'i faith in and of itself is going to be able to create enough of the let's say the energies that are going to be needed to begin to make the changes that we're going to need to be able to go forward in a world and develop beyond the crises we currently are living through. So let me just go and take a quotation from the House of Justice about the three interrelated areas of endeavor of Baha'i communities. Of course, there's expansion and consolidation. I was involved in expansion and consolidation all my life, starting as a Baha'i youth in the Carolinas in the United States, when I was pioneering in Africa or in Sri Lanka, in Asia, South Asia, and other countries. You know, we were always involved in the expansion and consolidation activities. And in addition to expansion and consolidation, there is, of course, other things that need to be going on at the same time. And that's what I really want to accent in this particular talk, is the social action, and particularly the participation in the prevalent discourses of society. I think these things are going to be very relevant in order to move the world into a situation where we begin to address these issues that, for the most part, are, at least from a political point of view around the world, if they've hardly even being recognized politically, and they're certainly not being dealt with in the ways in which they need to be dealt with in order to solve and go forward in developing the world culture that we're going to need. So on this particular slide, you know, in one of the Wellman Institute courses that I'm a faculty member of, it's based on a book called 11 Billion People. And in this book, we talk about not just the other crises. It's not just the coronavirus pandemic that we're talking about and climate change. There are so many other things that really are issues that are important to the world today. Can the earth sustain 7 billion people? It's a good question. In fact, I don't think it can. The degraded soil conditions, the way we're practicing our agriculture, this has to change, because, you know, we see that in the future we need more agriculture, and we're talking about seeing shortages of agricultural production in 10 or 15 years. But when we lose the quality of our soils because they're degraded, or the water is insufficient in different parts of the world to be able to sustain the economies that we have, there are so many different things that seem to be just crowding around and creating problems for the future, that we really need to step back a little bit as a society and deal more with these issues really as a kind of an active an action, so that we begin to make some progress on them. And so I think this is sort of what I would like to suggest in this particular talk, and why, to me, it's clear. We see all these things happening around us. I think it's clear we really need to do something about it. And so, you know, reading reality is something that we think is important to do in all of our activities. When, as a development specialist, whenever we went to a particular region and to undertake a development activity, the first thing we needed to do was to, of course, understand the reality of that particular region and the people who were living there, what their needs were, what their capabilities are, what kinds of resources do they have, how can they be educated to be able to do things and take control of their own destinies. We need to be able to read the reality. And of course, Shoghi Effendi urged that we should read the reality, we should understand these movements around the world, and even begin to correlate, you know, these reality to the Bahá'í teachings. And I think the more that we do this, the more that we will find there's actually really good ways to discuss these things in the context of the Bahá'í teachings that Baha'u'llah gave us, you know, over 150 years ago. And it's just exciting, really, to be Baha'i and to feel so confident that these things have been given to us, you know, through the revelation of the Baha'i faith. And just as my last slide, before we move into, let's say, some questions or some comments about what we've been discussing so far, you know, is again coming to the point of discourses. And here, when we're talking about discourses, we're talking about discourses in our family, at our jobs, in our communities, but there's a certain orientation that I think we need to. We live in a world of what we call post-truth or false news, and there's a lot of potential for conflict when we talk about some of the issues that are important today. And so the World Center really is suggesting to us that when we talk about this, we don't pretend that we're an academic and we're going to teach other people how it is and how it should be. In fact, we go into discourses with the posture of learning. And what we really want to do is stimulate a consultative process within the groups in which we're meeting to create, a unity within this group, so we can find ways to work together and to develop solutions to the whole series of issues that face the world today. And so, I think really, again, it is really clear to me that many of the issues, such as coronavirus or climate change or agricultural production or water or all of the other things that is important in the world today, that these solutions to these things are not going to be found in isolation. We really, as one of the previous speakers in another talked about, we're in a transition period where the world is really moving towards a one world situation, and in order to be able to move ahead and survive these periods, we're going to need to be able to find unity and understanding and love within the world. And so, well, okay, Daniel, that's enough, I think. From my point of view, I'd be very curious to hear, the comments of others and maybe continue the conversation.
Thank you very much for this great introduction. And quite interesting that you mentioned, actually, the revolution in Ukraine, because in the middle of the terrible news that we hear everywhere and this pandemic and the crisis that follow, we sometimes forget, or the good news or the positive changes sometimes go under the carpet and not really noticed. So it's glad that that was mentioned. And you mentioned Fazel as a question, but before that, we received a number of questions from from people as they registered. And one was, how do you deal with, because you talk about engaging in the discourse and having open conversations with other people. But how do we engage in this discourse on global governance with this America First mentality? So I'm here based in Madrid, you're based in Ukraine. Still, the US is an important power that is at the center of many conversations at the moment. So because of your expertise in consultation, because of the importance of entering this open dialogue, what are some ideas that come to mind on how we can approach these conversations meaningfully?
It's absolutely true. I mean, from the United States and other places around the world, to talk about global governance is problematic. There are many people who have really are quite frankly against the idea. And so my personal opinion is that we need to approach this subject slowly, not immediately going into it and saying, okay, we live in a world that we need global governance and we're going to have to change the global governing system, and that's the way it is. I think it's a much more productive way to begin to talk about these issues, these existential issues that are facing the world at this point in time, like climate change, and say, well, it's quite obvious, isn't it, that one country alone cannot solve the issues related to climate change. This is going to require countries coming together, finding common ground, agreeing on the processes will solve the issue, and doing this on a world scale together. Okay, that's almost a kind of a global governance. It's not, something like a different kind of a United Nations, but it is countries coming together and agreeing to do certain things. Now, that's happening already in terms of climate change, unfortunately, and you know, the agreements that have been made about countries working together for climate change, they're not being fully implemented, not enough, not fast enough, and the young people in the world are making this comment when they skip school on Fridays. But I think there are ways to approach the need for global governance, you know, by talking about other things, before we get to the point where we begin to say, okay, now let's talk about how are we going to organize this global governance, because there is a lot of difficulties in talking about this subject matter. I mean, when I was in the United States, even suggesting that we should have an international government was considered by some fundamentalist Christians as being a kind of the Antichrist movement. And of course, that is ridiculous when we put the context of, say, climate change or coronavirus or some of the other issues into an international perspective. There's no way these things can be solved unless we actually come together to try to solve them.
There's two more excellent questions, three in fact just came in. One is the first one from Fazal Faroudi. I guess he taps into your World Bank agriculture expert background. And he asks, how accurate is the statement that there is enough food produced to feed the entire population of the world, but it is not available to everyone? If so, should one approach be to make it available everyone, or at least in the areas that cannot cater for themselves? And he asked this connected to the fact that during this pandemic, there's all these food banks that are created, and Baha'i communities are getting involved in this kind of support. So obviously having food reach the needy seems to be an obvious thing. What do you think about the statement, there's enough food for everyone, and how can we improve this distribution, do you think?
Well, this is a complicated question, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it quickly. But let's put it this way. If everything before the coronavirus, there were a number of studies and scenarios that have been developed. You can find them on the internet. If you want, I can send them to you from my computer. But essentially saying that, you know, with the increasing populations in the world and the increasing use of meat, for example, in China, you know, we actually will have insufficient food for the entire planet, you know, in the next 10 to 20 years. It's predicted. Yeah. But actually that it has to be looked at in a lot of different ways. For example, right now we talk about the amount of produce that's being produced for animal production, right? And so we look at this section. On one hand, we have, you know, a lot of the land in the world, either pasture land or corn or maize production or soybeans, and these are being the land is being produced to feed animals and to allow us to have a diet with with meat in it. Now, if we decided to reduce the amount of meat that we're eating, then that production doesn't necessarily have to go to animals, and it could go towards human consumption. So I think there's many different ways in which this can work out, depending on how we come together as a group and decide how we're going to deal with it. I mean, if the world said, okay, listen, it's more important for everybody to have good quality food than having meat, then this changes things. You know, the other thing we could say is, like here in Ukraine. Ukraine has become a world exporter in the last 15 to 20 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And we have the capability, and it's actually the #1 export earning for the country at this point in time, which is very thankful in the time of war with Russia. But you know, we have the capability to sell this food to Africa, to the Middle East and other countries, and it's a great opportunity for Ukraine. But on the other hand, do these countries have the income to buy this food? So, I mean, we can produce it, yes, and it can be great for the economy here. But if, in the end of the day, the African countries are doesn't have sufficient income to be able to purchase this, then that breaks down. The system breaks down. In some way or another, we have to look at this holistically. That there are all of these things are being interconnected, and before we can answer some of these questions, we have to recognize that. And so, well, with the increase in world population and with the climate change that's taking place, I do think that we're talking about a future where food could be a problem, and it's being predicted to be so. But how to deal with it, I think it very much has to be done, again, from the perspective of an interconnected world and ways in which we can solve these problems to the benefit of all of us.
And if the worst come to the worst, I can see from your background, we can come to your farm. I can see that some food will be available there, so we're safe. And this, I'm saying this also because there's one question, and I'll get back to you, Peter. But first, Daniel said a question which connects to this, I think, in a sense. Should we not adopt the idea of glocalization? So starting with grassroots ideas and action, so this global mindset, but this local action. And your farm is probably a good example where you do values-based courses, obviously agriculture, feeding, teaching. From there, you go to teach university, you create courses. So what do you think about this glocalization concept?
No question about it, and it's very popular. And actually, people in the World Bank, like myself and others in the development community around the world, as well as just simple people living in rural areas, it's our belief that yes, that we will be much better served if the food is produced locally, and this is what we should be working on. But let me just say that if we talk about the current world situation, why are we in a situation where, you know, food production has been monopolized by huge corporations in the past 30 or 40 years during my professional lifetime? I mean, really, what we see is that the concept of producing food has been to consolidate these agricultural farms and these companies from the producer all the way to the consumer. And this is done with the concept of building a very strong business with good returns in the next quarter. Well, this is a very bad philosophy for the world and for the future of the world, and even for our own personal diets. I think most people recognize that local production is of better quality and better for the individual to purchase this and to be involved in this. But in fact, what we find in many places around the world is that many of the consumers in the urban areas have now the mentality, they go into a supermarket and they really are looking for the least, you know, costly and the brightest and most cleanest looking product. They're not thinking that, you know, we should be more interested in thinking about the conservation of the rural areas and making sure that the quality of our food is much more important. They're more in the mentality of the current world in the United States, in Europe, and other places around the world, is that we really want to have be able to buy our food at a very reasonable price, at the lowest possible price, and we just go down to the supermarket and do it. We don't want to put in the extra time or energy to think about getting it locally. And I think that's going to be a problem, and it will become an increasing problem in the future. And so I worked, just specifically for Ukraine, for 20 years. I worked on the establishment, the system for small and medium production of agricultural products. And I'll be honest with you, I'm still writing a document about it now for a German bank. We lost to the large corporate agricultural systems that are more or less taken over the production in Ukraine. They're making quite a bit of money exporting products, but they're also contributing to lack of proper conservation, some ecological issues, too many pesticides are being used. The quality of our food is questionable at times, and so where we really see the difficulties is that, you know, we have so many different interconnected things, and we don't have the capability now as a culture, even locally and internationally, to be able to come together and work out solutions for everybody's benefit. They seem to be mostly for the benefit these days of the large multinational corporations in agriculture.
And I guess there is some hope. I was just reading, there was a Google trend that mentioned that one of the trend with the highest growth, something like 4,000%, was sustainable living. So right now people are searching as individuals, as human beings there, and that there was local purchase. So obviously the situation is calling for at least a different inquiry, a different point of view. And Peter, I promise I'll get back to your points, but before, just to stay on this food area, David and Rennie Lee, they ask you to mention or just say something about permaculture or agroecology, and how can that help the food problem, but also the environmental degradation. Do you have any thoughts on that, on those specific areas? And obviously the whole environmental food eating is one thing. We don't want to eat food and then destroy the planet, so there's there's nothing left to live in. Any thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that are these are all appropriate and necessary in the current context, but changing to this kind of a concept of production and conservation of our environment is going to be problematic in the current context. So we really need to be able to find other ways to make this work. Let me give an example. Whatever we want, whatever we're going to do, let's say in small and medium and agriculture, whether it's permaculture or whether it's other types of things, you know, the people living on the land, they need to be able to make a living. You know, they need to be able to create enough income for their families to be able to take care of themselves. So it's about permaculture, and it's about growing, and it's about providing locally these particular products. And it's also the possibility for local producers to be able to live in a rural area and to thrive in a rural area for themselves and for their family. At this point in time, quite frankly, I'd say maybe I'm a bit too forward about this, but a lot of the agriculture is really in people who are producing in agriculture are really at the are being controlled a lot by by even the seeds that they buy, the various activities that they're doing, and the market into which they sell. This is really more or less determining the kind of decisions they have to make on a day-to-day basis about how they're going to live, you know, how they're going to support. And so what we see is a large number of people on these small and medium farms aren't able to make enough income. And because of that, they are leaving the farms and they are renting it out to large commercial activities. And so really, why is this happening? In a way, I think part of the reason it's happening is because our cultures as a whole are not realizing that in order to have the kind of permaculture and local production that we really need to have a good quality food supply and go forward into the future, then we're really going to have to be able to, let's say, have an economic system that allows these producers and these families that are living and doing this work to be successful in their environment. And at this point in time, in many places around the world, this is not possible. In my village, for example, almost all the young people have left because they don't find enough work and they don't want to stay in a rural area and be unemployed or underemployed, and so they run off to Poland. I mean, there's about 2 million young people that have gone to Poland to work in agriculture there, and another couple of many people have gone to the cities to find work there. And really, in many cases, the kind of work and the kind of life they find in the city is not even as good for them as the kind of life they had when they lived here in the rural areas. So I think it's both a technical and an economics, and it's very much related to the structure of the societies in which we're living. As a society don't rise up to face these things, then those that are controlling these markets, the very large corporations, the laws that are being changed to be of advantage to these, they are really determining what we can do and what we cannot do in the current situation.
And I'm not sure if it's because it's lunchtime, US time, and dinner time here in Madrid, but there's a lot of food questions coming up again. And then we're going to tackle some questions that have come up in YouTube about what can we do practically in corruption. But first, there's 2 more questions on food. And Annelema Koijam asked something about food security. And so, whatever the scarcity or monopoly or barriers, then instability ensues. Do you have anything on this topic of food security?
Well, it's as I said, there are predictions, and we do expect in the future, and not in the future like maybe I won't be alive to see it, but the young people today will be alive to see the future where food issues and food problems and food shortages is going to be a food security issue. This there's a lot of food that's being produced in the planet today, and how it's being used, whether it's for livestock or whether it's for crop production. You know, that's again an economic question, and a question that many countries can deal with. But I think in terms of food security, you know, from a scientific or a technical point of view, we really have a great capacity to be able to produce food locally and to make it, you know, available locally in ways in which people can thrive and not be in a secure issue. During the current crisis with the coronavirus, of course, you know, we hear subjects right now. We hear about, you know, meat factories, pork factories, that because of the coronavirus, they're going to they've had to shut down, and maybe it's going to cause meat shortages for the coronaviruses. And then if there's meat shortages because of the coronaviruses, then the farmers that are producing corn and other products for feeding these meat that goes into the meat markets, you know, are also going to have problems because they're going to lose income to their particular production. So again, what I see in terms of food security is that this is a whole interrelated aspect of life on the planet. And, you know, I think we as a society are willing to stand up and deal with these subjects. During my lifetime, I've always felt that, you know, most people were satisfied, you know, with, they could go down to the supermarket and buy just about anything that they wanted, you know, at relatively reasonable prices. But it seems to be changing. And it's not the way that's going to be sustainable for the future. I think it's just an interrelated issue to be dealt with in an interrelated way.
And you mentioned in your presentation the role of youth. So I thought that pose to you a question from a perennial youth millennial, Arthur Dahl. And Arthur asked about digital technology, which all millennials would ask about that. So, you know, you mentioned that the pandemic may well be disrupting food production. So could digital technologies be the answer? Could they manage and balance better the food production, the distribution, and adequate enough food for everybody? You know, distribute the revenues more equally, organize distribution. Do you think that digital technologies could be the solution to this food crisis that we're likely to be stepping into?
Well, yes. Well, first of all, Arthur and I've known Arthur since I was 18 or 19 years old. And so, I mean, I did learn a lot from him at that point in time, and we're still together in many different ways. But, you know, digital technology is here, and it is applied in agriculture, anywhere from growing until marketing. And really, the information that's now available, for example, in production of even small and medium farms in Ukraine, and particularly the large farms, all of the different activities that go on the farm are actually being put into the cloud. And we know exactly, you know, even, for example, in my region, 10 years ago, we hardly saw a tractor, but now all night long, we may hear noises coming through the woods from, you know, because it's very quiet at night. There's no cars around here because tractors are running up and down with no lights in the middle of the night, 24 hours a day, because they don't need to see anymore. They're using all the digital technologies to prepare the land, to plant it, to take care of it, and to harvest it, and to and everything else. But all of this information is really going into the hands of the large corporates that are utilizing it for maximizing their profits. And this, of course, you know, so in one hand, yes, all of this information is available, and we can use that information to make proper choices about how we're going to produce and how we're going to market and that. But at least from my perspective here in Ukraine and what I see happening in other parts around the world, most of the artificial intelligence and the information that's coming digitally to us is being utilized to maximize the profits of not small producers and not local production, but actually those large corporations that are really have taken over much of the development in agriculture around the world, and so I think that this digital technology, I mean, it's great. We can do so many things, and we don't really need to look after a lot of the things that we used to do manually in terms of looking after the kinds of resources that are being used and how we've been using them. That's all being given to us in digital format almost automatically through the sensors that we put on our different pieces of equipment. But I think it's being utilized by the wrong group right now that's more interested in making money in the next quarter than looking after the needs of the people in the population for today and for future generations.
So now, food aside, the other concept that you've very importantly opened up is engaging the discourse and just opening our opportunity for discourse. And there's a question from YouTube from Greg Young, who says, as Baha'is, what can we do? He's thinking of opening the homes for discourse on these topics, create a groundswell. Peter, and fancy asking an Italian to ask this, so I'm going to disrupt your surname. I think it's Haug or Hoig, but Peter Hoig is mentioning that, for example, he's writing on a local newspaper, which in itself is amazing that newspapers still exist and localization. So thank God for that, Peter. And in his column is able to just put some Baha'i quotes here and there, and they seem to be well received. And he just underlines there's so many ways in which each one of us can elevate the discourse. So connecting those two questions, elevating the discourse, what can we practically do? What are some suggestions that come to mind? Something that you do as well.
Let's start with something that I do, because, these issues are there. I mean, I was an agricultural specialist. I have background and training in that and in rural development, but that didn't mean that I knew everything about anything. But at this point in time, literature is available for many different subjects that are really existential crises and issues, and very good literature written by very well-known and very good analytical specialists in the world. And so the first thing to me is we need to educate ourselves individually and spend too much time watching Netflix and other things of this nature, but picking up some of these books that are really quite well written, because we're not getting this information from other sources, So much of the information really to deal with the crises and the different issues that exist around the world today, you're really not getting it unless you go out and looking for it. But if you go out and look for it, you find it. The first thing is that we need to make sure that we're really getting the information that we need, because that's not being, I mean, there's even someone who said that the most crazy thing about world society is that the more important the issue is, the less we talk about it, the less we think about it in societies. But I do think that I go back to something that I read as a Baha'i youth. I mean, there was Rihya Khanum wrote a pamphlet called "Success in Teaching," many different years, and it was, of course, that when we're teaching the faith, we tend to tell everybody in our immediate surroundings about Baha'i issues and some of the social teachings of the Baha'i faith, but we tend to let's say reach a limit. We stay within that group of people and we don't expand it into other groups. What we really need to be doing is to expand into other groups. For example, when we talk about climate change groups, we have literally tens of thousands of young people out on the streets, talking about climate change today, or they're talking about other issues. And we as Baha'is, I think, should be in the middle of these groups. We should not be away from them saying, "Oh, we're the Baha'i faith, and we have answers to these situations, and we're going to do our thing, and you do your thing." I don't believe that's the right way to do it. I really think we need to combine our efforts with like-thinking individuals and work together in a way that we discussed in terms of the discourses, in a way where we're not trying to put forth our, the saviors of the world, we know everything, but in fact, we go in with the object of learning with them and working out solutions with other groups, and I think this is to have this kind of social activism is the only way that we're going to impact on the political forces in the world today that seem to be totally ignoring these things. They're more worried about, getting elected and thing, and what's going to happen if they say things that people don't like, and they're not going to elect them. And so somehow, how do we impact, the upper levels of society that are making decisions at the political level in terms of laws and organization of activities in the culture? Well, the top level doesn't seem to be doing it. So we need to have some kind of more activities on the bottom level, joining with other groups, participating with them as Baha'is, and working with them to overcome these things. And I think these are important. Of course, going out to your local newspaper, in any other ways that we can to discuss these things. But even though they're difficult subject matters, and many of them are really can even be problems and to discuss, I think we need to have the courage to go out and say these issues are very important to the world today, and we would like to talk to you and work with you and work with society in general to begin to work on them. Because as long as we ignore them, they get worse. Every time we do nothing about these things, every day that goes by, I think that we don't deal with the issues of climate change. Every day that goes by when we're not thinking about how are we going to deal with the coronavirus? How are we going to live through this? How are we going to find, a new paradigm after the coronavirus? If we just put these things off and we don't think about them, we don't talk about them, we don't have discussions about them, then I think we're only every day making it worse, the outcome of this worse. And that's not what we would really like to see.
And I even posted in the chat the creative idea, or maybe I just posted, or I think I can post to everybody later, the creative idea that you had, Gary, of creating your YouTube channel. So there's really no limit in how we can use resources, just open and just share and start those open conversations with everybody in a very public and open way, in a way that we understand each other as well as state some important points. And you touched on an element that Sarah Barouhani was actually asking: what is the level of awareness of world leaders of the concepts of global governance discussed in the writings of Shoghi Effendi, and what can the Baha'i community do to raise this awareness? So if I can write to everybody, I'll share the book from Arthur, Maya, and Augusto on this area and your work, but maybe you want to speak to this as well.
Well, I mean, yes, the book is right. Everything was done is perfect. It's a beautiful work that's been done by these three, and everything they say in it, I think, I can subscribe to at least 100%, if not 101%. But I think it's going to impact many of the leaders in the world today. Not tomorrow. They're going to this book and it's out there and it's all very wonderful. But okay, we got other things to talk about. Somehow or another, we have to find a way to bring these issues to the front, and I don't know how to do this. We see the Baha'i youth, of course, that are working in their communities, but when we see the other youth in climate change, women's rights, and child and that sort of thing, out there working, and how do these things have enough groundswell, enough development, so that the attention of those people that are making the decisions at the higher levels is actually going to be affected. I often wonder, in Ukraine and in other countries around the world, how the 1%, the ones that have all of these riches, that seem to be making laws that seem to be to their benefits. I don't understand it. I don't understand how they think. I don't understand what their position is in life, and what their position in what kind of life are they really thinking that this is creating. Is there a spiritual element to this individual? I think the spiritual element to these individuals would be, that they recognize that they are just part of a world society, and that, for example, I've had discussions with my wife who didn't really understand why we spend our family money on developing a social action project for youth in Ukraine. And she said, well, I mean, is this going to be possible? Is it good to use? Is this going to be useful? And I said, well, the thing is that we have enough. We don't need more. We don't need a bigger house. We don't need, the bigger car. We have enough. We need to be able to give back something. And I don't understand why this concept is not bigger and wider among all of the peoples, particularly of those that have more capacity and money. And so I, for example, one of the things that I've always lived in my life as a pioneer, and I've believed in since the 70s and 80s when we talked about materialism out on the streets, is that we really should live a minimalistic type of a lifestyle. There's so many things that we don't need to be happy. And all of the facts show that we may have increased income and everything may be looking good from a financial point of view, but that doesn't affect our happiness at all. And that's what's been shown in the data in country after country and year after year. So we have a certain amount of need that all of us need in order to achieve happiness. And above that, it doesn't improve our happiness, and we have capability to use this to help other people or to help other societies. And why those people at the top, what's happened to them in their mental infrastructure, that they're not thinking this and doing something about it, is really quite not understandable to me. We need to think of ways to bring to their attention the fact that we really must, as a society, be more interested in the well-being of everybody and not our own personal well-being.
And there's a stream of questions, but there's one I like that I'm just picking out from Shalas T. Shalas T, indeed. Do you think that this pandemic is uniting us?
Good question. I
Very
think
good,
the answer.
Good question.
Good question. And I think the answer is it's certainly waking us up. I think that's the first. It is like it's there. It's in front of us, and it's changed our life. Our life is not like it was yesterday, and we have to think about it. And we're thinking, and we're listening to the news, and we're hearing that who knows what's going to happen about work. What are jobs going to look like? Where are these trillions of dollars coming from in the national budget that we're giving out, during this particular crisis? People must be thinking about these things, and that even things like universal health care and all of these things, they must be coming to the attention of people because we're being forced to see these things because of the coronavirus. And so, in that sense, I think yes, the possibility exists that this can unite us, and I think that is the wish that we really must be working towards, is that this will increase our unity. I mean, you hear every day, that the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States, are not as divided about these issues as they are about everything else before the coronavirus. When it comes to the coronavirus and what needs to be done, they seem to be much more united. You hear the pundits talking about it. So I think the possibility for uniting us is there, and I think the harder the impact of this crisis hits us, the more possibilities, because the only way to, let's say, resolve this crisis in a way that, let's say, doesn't lead to massive social disruption is that we unite and come around and find ways to get around this. I mean, I've read in books about artificial intelligence that maybe all of the truck drivers in the United States, which is like, I don't know, 30% of the working population, they may be out of a job because of artificial intelligence in the next 15 years. And the question is, well, what do these people do after they're out of this job? Are they just going to sit at home and say, oh, well, not too much, bad, and no more job, it's all over, and what to do next? I don't think so. And I don't think that those people that are out of work today in the United States and other countries around the world because of the coronavirus, when we begin to come out of this problem, and if they don't have work and they don't have ways to survive and to feed their family and take care of their family, or to live in the home that they're renting or they're paying a mortgage on, then what are those people going to do? One option is that they could go out and cause disruption, and we see some of that taking place in some places. But the better alternative would be that if somehow we come out of this, well, this is a real problem, and we have to change the way we've been doing things because they're not going to work like that in the future.
And I'm not sure if you can. I hope that everybody can see the question and answer, because Peter keeps sending lots of really great advice on how to move forward, including the underlining one that we are all interconnected. So that's not our nice interconnected, but my action has an influence. Action that I do on an algorithm will put a truck driver out of the work. So this awareness, I think, is a very important one. But I wonder on Eric Harmson's question about universal basic income, because of this concept of so many people becoming part of this, I think the term is useless society, or the people that cannot find a job because their skills are not useful. And then the universal basic income concept. I'm not sure if it's something that you've studied at all or that you have any comments on. Is that a solution? Is that a way forward? Is that something that could be creating the advancement and the prosperity that we're seeking?
Well, what I know, I'm not an expert on it. What I know is, and what was the name of the politician that was going for president and no longer has dropped out of it? I can't. But anyway, he also wrote a book about artificial intelligence. Can't think of the name right now. But let's put it this way: if you do read a little bit about this, and I've read a little bit about it. First of all, it's not a new concept. I think this concept has been numerous times in the last 20 years. And many people have proposed this as a concept that it could be very successful for society in general. But now, how that actually works, I'm not an expert about it, and I can't really talk about it. But what I can say is that it has been repeatedly suggested over the last 20 years or more as a positive strategy, for our society and for living in the world today. And in a way, what we're seeing in terms of the help that the national governments like the United States are giving to their people during this crisis, and the checks that are being sent. I received here in Ukraine, I received a check, because I pay taxes in the United States still. I received a check almost immediately, from the national government because of the crisis. And of course, it helps all of us to live. But this basic income seems to be a solution that solves a lot of problems and allows us greater flexibility in trying to work in our ways or out of problems in the world today. So personally, I think that there must be something behind it. And we're beginning to see in action today in the United States that something like that seems to be going on, in the world. And I think without it, many of these people would be in really dire straits.
And I think we have to close on the hour because Paul Hanley, you mentioned Paul Hanley's book, right?
11 billion people.
So he has a question for you. Abdul Baha promotes the idea of village reconstruction as a first step in economic development. However, we see village life declining almost everywhere. Do you see the potential to restore village life in countries with more rural populations such as Canada and in the US? And that will be your closing remark to end this webinar.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. And you know the answer, I think, already before I answer myself. But I think, okay, everybody has a vision of what the future is going to look like. So we as Baha'is know that agriculture is not a subject at the bottom of the list. In fact, Baha'u'llah has actually said in many cases that it's a subject that should be at the top of the list of issues that we're dealing with. And so, when we talk about agriculture and in the work that I've done in Ukraine and other places around the world, again, we get back to the family farms, small and medium agriculture. That is really a wonderful way because, when we talk about huge farms, we may have one person that's looking after, let's say, 5,000 hectares of land. Whereas if you're looking at a small and medium farm, you have one person that's maybe looking at 100 hectares or 200 hectares of land. The one family who's taking care of, reasonable amounts of land is doing a better job of taking care of the ecology of it and looking at the different ways of producing and doing the local production and making ways to connect to the local societies around them. But the one thing that I think that we need to make this work is I don't believe that individual farmers today are going to be successful on their own. And really, if we go back in history, and I usually like to use the history of Raiffeisen, in many countries. You hear about Raiffeisen banks around the world. But in Germany, in the middle of the 19th century, the same time of Abdul Baha, there was a Raiffeisen who went into rural areas and taught the rural areas that if they come together in a collective, cooperative environment, and they work together for their own development, even if they save money together and they find means in which to share, let's say, productive capability and decision makings, that this created a cooperative movement that exists today in Europe as one of the most vital forms of small and medium business development in Europe and in other parts around the world. So, the possibility exists, even among small farms of relatively modest, let's say, economic status, when they come together as a community, they have the ability to form these cooperatives, these communities, and these have been, by and large, throughout history, successful. And even, of course, in the history of Abdul Baha himself, a community in Israel during the time of Abdul Baha was kind of a cooperative that was developed, that was successful, and I think even led to the Abdul Baha had received what is it in the UK that you get when you
knighthood?
The knighthood, yes, and received the knighthood for what he's done. So I think look in other parts of the world outside of Europe and the United States. We go to Africa or we go to India or South Asia or whatever. I do think that that small medium production and cooperatives are the future. I mean, even more, maybe what we see in the United States is that it's gone in the other way towards the large corporate agricultural schemes, that exist, that have manipulated the laws and the legislation to give them an advantage. But I think that's going to fall apart, hopefully, in some time in the future, because I don't think it's ecologically sustainable. But in the other parts of the world, we see these small and medium farms that are able to come together as a community. And by the way, I think Baha'i community development is absolutely almost a prerequisite for the development of a strong, interconnected, united community to work together for their own benefit as a community in different places around the world. So if I were to say what is the future in terms of agriculture in many places around the world, I certainly would say that small and medium development of different kinds, in communities that work on a community level and work together as partners and as collaborators, I believe that this is the only real future. And anything that goes away from that is a kind of a temporary effect that seems to be created by let's say, legal structures that have changed for the cooperatives and for the corporate sector.
And Gary, I think this collaborative way of working together from the grassroots, from the local communities, engaging these discourses. Thank you so much for having offered us so many insights on this. Everybody's commenting on how great your insights were. Thank you very much. I left a link to the next EBBF annual conference where we'll be rethinking success. And even more important, Fazal Foroudi mentioned the letter of the House of Justice dated 1st of March 2017, which EBBF goes back every day, which offers so many insights on the economic developments in the world. Gary, once again, thank you so much. Amazing as always, and look forward to the next EBBF webinar. Thank you.
Great being here. Great talking with all of you. Thank you very much.